In fact, the Romans actually became masters of the art of the crucifixion. They were not the originators, they were the masters because they had designed things, they had fine-tuned things so that they could create so much pain.
Raising the victim up on the patibulum and then fastening it onto the stake, it looks efficient. It breathes of an efficient Roman army that's in control of the empire.
The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most profound moments in human history. It's a moment that not only defined the course of Christianity, but also shaped the future of religious thought across the world. But behind this monumental event lies a complex web of political, legal, and social factors. At the heart of the matter is Roman law, the governing force in the land of Judea at the time of Jesus' execution. Why did Rome, under the guidance of Pontius Pilate, approve the execution of a man who seemed to pose no immediate threat to the empire? To fully understand why Rome sanctioned the crucifixion of Jesus, we must delve into the intricate legal, political, and social dynamics of the period. Let's explore this story by stepping back into the world of ancient Judea, where Roman authority was the law of the land, but where the tension between Roman and Jewish leadership was ever present. The story begins with Roman control over the province of Judea. By the time of Jesus, Judea had been under Roman occupation for nearly a century. After the Romans conquered Jerusalem in 63 BCE, they installed client kings like Herod the Great to govern on their behalf. But after Herod's death, Roman emperors began to place their own governors in control, one of whom was Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate held the title of prefect, a role that gave him authority over the region's military and judicial matters. Roman governors like Pilate were tasked with one primary objective: maintaining peace in the provinces, especially in regions as volatile as Judea. The Jewish people had a long history of rebellion against foreign rule, and maintaining order in such an environment was a delicate balancing act. Pilate's role was clear: enforce Roman law, maintain public order, and prevent any form of insurrection that could threaten Roman dominance. While he had absolute power to judge cases, including those of life and death, Pilate's authority came with political pressure. He had to answer to the Roman emperor, and any unrest in his region could jeopardize his position. Pontius Pilate, the fifth governor of the Roman province of Judea, played a critical role in the region's complex and tense relationship with the Roman Empire during the 1st century AD. His name is forever tied to the trial and crucifixion of Jesus Christ, but his governance and actions in 187 Judea reveal a broader picture of his administrative style, his interactions with the Jewish population, and his position within the Roman political structure. An archaeological discovery known as the Pilate Stone serves as concrete evidence that Pontius Pilate existed and held the position of governor or prefect of ancient Judea. This important find solidifies his historical presence and role in the region, providing a direct link to his governance during the Roman period. Pilate was appointed by Emperor Tiberius around AD 26, serving as the Roman prefect or governor of Judea. His role was primarily military and judicial, with the responsibility of maintaining order in a region that was fraught with tension due to its religious and cultural identity. Judea was not an easy province to govern. It was an area where Jewish religious traditions often clashed with Roman laws and expectations. As the Roman governor, Pilate's duties included collecting taxes, overseeing infrastructure, and, most importantly, maintaining peace. The latter required him to manage relations between various groups, including the Jewish religious leaders, the Roman settlers, and other local populations. His power was substantial, as he was the representative of Roman law, with the authority to enforce capital punishment. Pilate's tenure as governor was marked by several incidents that sparked unrest among the Jewish population. These events highlight both his insensitivity toward Jewish religious customs and the delicate balance he attempted to strike between Roman authority and Jewish concerns. One of Pilate's first controversial actions was bringing Roman military standards, which bore the image of Emperor Tiberius, into Jerusalem. This act was seen as a violation of Jewish laws prohibiting images, especially in their holy city. The Jewish population protested vigorously, and Pilate initially refused to remove the standards. According to Jewish historian Josephus, it was only after a significant demonstration that Pilate relented, showing his willingness to avoid outright rebellion, but also his initial lack of understanding or care for Jewish customs. Another notable conflict occurred when Pilate used funds from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct to bring water into Jerusalem. While this was arguably a necessary public work, using sacred money for a Roman project outraged the Jewish people, leading to another protest. Pilate ordered soldiers to disguise themselves among the crowd, and on his command, they attacked the protesters, resulting in numerous deaths. This incident illustrates Pilate's preference for maintaining order through force rather than negotiation or diplomacy. Pilate's role in the trial and crucifixion of Jesus is the most well-known aspect of his tenure. The Gospels describe Pilate as a reluctant participant in the events leading to Jesus' execution. According to the Gospel accounts, Pilate initially found no fault in Jesus, but the pressure from the Jewish leaders and the crowd pushed him towards sentencing Jesus to death. From a historical perspective, Pilate's actions in this case can be seen as politically motivated. Jesus was perceived by the Jewish authorities as a potential threat to their power and to the fragile stability in Judea. Pilate, concerned with keeping order and avoiding any uprisings, may have viewed Jesus as a minor figure who could be sacrificed to appease the crowd and maintain peace. His infamous act of washing his hands during the trial, as described in the Gospels, symbolizes his attempt to distance himself from the responsibility for Jesus' death, but it also highlights his political calculation. Despite his initial survival of the tensions in Judea, Pilate's hash method eventually led to his downfall. Around AD 36, an uprising occurred in Samaria, and Pilate responded with excessive force, slaughtering many Samaritans in what was seen as an unnecessary display of brutality. This event triggered a formal complaint to the Roman authorities, and Pilate was recalled to Rome to face charges. However, by the time he arrived, Emperor Tiberius had died, and the historical record of what happened to Pilate afterward is unclear. Some sources suggest he was exiled or even committed suicide, while others are silent on his fate. Pilate's legacy is a complex one. To the Roman authorities, he was likely seen as a governor who did what was necessary to maintain order in a difficult province. However, his harsh measures, coupled with his misunderstanding of the Jewish population's religious sensitivities, made him a deeply unpopular figure among the Jews. When we think of the trial of Jesus, many of us focus on his questioning before the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin. But this trial was not the final word. The Jewish leaders did not have the authority to execute criminals under Roman law. They could condemn someone to death according to their own religious laws, but the final approval for such a sentence had to come from the Roman governor. Roman law was very structured when it came to capital punishment. Pilate had to follow specific legal procedures when handling cases that could lead to execution. The Roman legal system was rooted in both military and civil law, designed to maintain the power and stability of the empire. Pilate's decisions, therefore, had to reflect Rome's overarching interests. When Jesus was brought before Pilate, the accusation presented was not simply one of religious blasphemy, as the Jewish leaders initially charged. The accusation was political. They claimed that Jesus had called himself King of the Jews, a title that posed a direct threat to Roman authority. In Roman law, any claim to kingship, particularly in a region as rebellious as Judea, was considered sedition, and sedition was a capital offense under Roman law. Now let's talk about the dynamics between the Jewish religious authorities and Roman political power. Judea was unique because it was governed by both Roman law and Jewish religious laws. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, held authority over religious matters, and they adhered strictly to the laws of the Torah. However, when it came to matters of capital punishment, they had to defer to Roman rule. The Jewish leaders viewed Jesus as a blasphemer because he claimed to be the Son of God. According to Jewish law, this was an offense punishable by death, but they couldn't execute him without Roman consent. This created a complicated situation. The religious leaders needed to find a way to frame Jesus' actions as not just a religious offense, but as a political one that Pilate would care about. And so, the narrative shifts from a religious dispute to a political charge. The Jewish leaders accused Jesus of claiming kingship, which they knew would catch the attention of Roman officials like Pilate. For the Romans, anyone claiming to be a king was seen as a potential rival to Caesar, and therefore, a direct threat to Roman rule. Let's step into the shoes of Pontius Pilate for a moment. Pilate was in a precarious position. On the one hand, he didn't see Jesus as a real threat to Roman rule. Jesus didn't have an army, he didn't seem to be leading a rebellion, and Pilate was initially reluctant to execute him. But on the other hand, Pilate was under tremendous political pressure. The Jewish leaders were persistent, and the crowd was growing more restless by the minute. The last thing Pilate needed was a riot or an insurrection in Jerusalem, especially during Passover, when the city was filled with pilgrims and tensions ran high. Pilate's ultimate concern wasn't religious blasphemy, it was maintaining public order. His primary duty as a Roman governor was to keep peace in the region. If a riot broke out, it could be reported back to Rome, and Pilate's position would be in jeopardy. So Pilate faced a dilemma. He didn't want to execute an innocent man, but he also didn't want to risk unrest or rebellion. In the end, Pilate made a pragmatic decision. He chose to execute Jesus to prevent further conflict, even though he knew it wasn't just. The specific charge that led to Jesus' crucifixion was his claim to be King of the Jews. From a Roman legal perspective, this was a serious accusation. Rome tolerated many religious practices and beliefs in its provinces, as long as they didn't interfere with political order. But any claim to kingship or political power was viewed as a direct challenge to Caesar. Jesus' claim of kingship wasn't just about religion. In the eyes of the Romans, it was about power and authority. If Jesus was claiming to be a king, that meant he was challenging the rule of Rome. Even if his kingdom wasn't of this world, as he told Pilate, the political implications were enough to warrant execution. The title King of the Jews was dangerous because it carried with it the hope of Jewish independence. Throughout Judea's history, there had been numerous revolts and uprisings against foreign rulers, many of them led by people who claimed to be the rightful king of Israel. For the Romans, Jesus' claim was seen as a potential rallying point for rebellion, and that was something they couldn't afford to ignore. Rebellion was a constant threat in Judea. The Jewish people had a long history of fighting for their independence, and Roman rulers were always on edge, waiting for the next revolt to break out. From the Roman perspective, Jesus' execution was about preventing a future uprising. Even if Jesus himself wasn't leading a rebellion, his followers might rise up in his name after his death. Pilate understood that the situation in Jerusalem was volatile. The Jewish leaders were agitating for Jesus' execution. The crowd was growing more and more unruly, and Passover was a time when the city was filled with religious fervor. It didn't take much to ignite a rebellion in such an atmosphere. Pilate likely saw Jesus' crucifixion as a way to prevent a larger conflict. By executing Jesus publicly, he could send a message to anyone else who might consider challenging Roman authority. Crucifixion was a brutal form of punishment, designed not only to kill but to humiliate and deter others from following in the same footsteps. Crucifixion wasn't just a method of execution, it was a tool of Roman power. The Romans used crucifixion to make an example of those who challenged their authority. It was reserved for the worst criminals, those guilty of treason, sedition, or rebellion. For the Romans, crucifixion was a way of sending a clear message. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. When Jesus was sentenced to be crucified, it wasn't just about putting him to death. It was about making an example of him in the most public and humiliating way possible. Crucifixions were often carried out in highly visible places, like busy roads or city entrances, so that as many people as possible would see the punishment and be reminded of Roman power. For Pilate, crucifying Jesus wasn't just a way to placate the Jewish leaders, it was a way to reinforce Roman control over Judea. By executing Jesus publicly, Pilate could show that any challenge to Roman rule, no matter how small, would be met with the full force of the empire. The key to understanding why Rome approved of Jesus' execution lies in the distinction between blasphemy and sedition. Blasphemy was a religious charge, and while it was a serious offense under Jewish law, it didn't hold much weight in Roman law. Rome allowed the provinces to practice their own religions, as long as they didn't interfere with political stability. But sedition, challenging the authority of the emperor, was a different matter entirely. From the Roman perspective, anyone who claimed to be a king or who incited rebellion against the empire was a threat to the peace and security of the region. This is why the Jewish leaders framed Jesus' claim to be the Son of God as a political threat. By accusing Jesus of claiming kingship, They ensured that the charge would resonate with Roman authorities. Pilate may not have cared much about the religious implications of Jesus' claim, but he couldn't ignore the political ones. If Jesus was indeed claiming to be king, he was challenging the very foundation of Roman rule in Judea, and for that, he had to be executed. Public perception played a significant role in the events leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. Pilate was not only concerned about maintaining order in the moment, but also about how his actions would be perceived by the Jewish people and by his superiors in Rome. Rome was a vast empire, and its control over its provinces was maintained through a combination of military power and psychological manipulation. Public executions like crucifixions were a way of reinforcing Roman authority in the minds of the people. By executing Jesus in front of a large crowd, Pilate was sending a message: Rome is in control, and any challenge to that control will be dealt with swiftly and brutally. At the same time, Pilate had to walk a fine line between appeasing the Jewish leaders and maintaining his own authority. If he refused to execute Jesus, he risked a rebellion. But if he executed Jesus without cause, he could face backlash from both the Jewish people and the Roman emperor. In the end, Pilate chose the path of least resistance. He washed his hands of the matter, literally and figuratively, and allowed the execution to proceed. As the political pressures mounted, Pilate, despite his personal hesitations, eventually gave the order that would change the course of history. In a cold, calculated move to maintain control and order, he ordered that Jesus be scourged. Roman scourging was not a mere beating, but a brutal punishment designed to weaken the condemned to the point of death even before the crucifixion. The scourging was excruciating, designed to maximize pain and suffering, leaving the victim barely alive. Blood poured from his back, his body already broken, but this was only the beginning of the ordeal. After the scourging, the soldiers mockingly crowned him with a wreath of thorns, pressing it deep into his scalp. They adorned him with a purple robe, laughing and kneeling in cruel imitation of reverence, hailing him as King of the Jews. But there was more suffering to come. Weakened, Jesus was forced to carry the heavy wooden cross through the narrow streets of Jerusalem, now teeming with people, many of whom had once cheered for him. The weight of the cross crushed his shoulders, and every step was an agonizing struggle. The journey to Golgotha, known as the place of the skull, was long and grueling. As Jesus stumbled under the weight, the Roman soldiers, impatient and eager to finish their task, conscripted Simon of Cyrene to help him carry the cross. When they arrived at Golgotha, the Roman executioners began the final horrific act of crucifixion. The pain of crucifixion was unbearable. The nails driven through his wrists and feet were not meant to kill instantly, but to prolong suffering. Every breath was a torment as Jesus' body sagged under its own weight. To breathe, he had to push himself up with his nailed feet, causing unbearable pain to shoot through his entire body. The crucifixion process was designed to be slow and agonizing, with death often taking hours, sometimes days. As Jesus hung on the cross, the sky darkened. The weight of the moment was felt by all present, both followers and mockers alike. And yet, even in his agony, Jesus spoke words that would echo through eternity. He cried out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This plea for forgiveness, directed at his executioners and those who condemned him, spoke volumes of the divine grace and love that defined his mission on earth. As the hours passed, the suffering continued, with soldiers and onlookers jeering, daring him to come down from the cross. But this was not a defeat. This was the culmination of a divine plan that stretched back through the ages. In this moment of ultimate suffering, Jesus was fulfilling a purpose far greater than anyone there could comprehend. And so, in the final moments, Jesus uttered the words, "It is finished," a declaration not of surrender, but of completion. With his last breath, he proclaimed the end of his earthly mission. The reconciliation between humanity and God had been achieved through his sacrifice. His body hung limp, lifeless, and the earth itself seemed to tremble. The veil of the temple was torn in two, symbolizing the new access to God that Jesus' death had secured. But even in death, there was no peace for Jesus' body. Roman efficiency demanded that the dead be quickly removed, especially with the approaching Sabbath. His body was taken down from the cross and hastily placed in a nearby tomb, with a heavy stone rolled across the entrance to seal it shut. And so ended the earthly life of Jesus of Nazareth, executed by Roman law, sanctioned by political expediency, and yet this was far from the end of the story. The crucifixion of Jesus wasn't just a political resolution or the execution of a man. It was the pivotal act of redemption for humanity, one that would transform not only the lives of those who followed him, but the course of history itself. 3 days later, this same man, who had been scourged, mocked, and crucified, would rise from the tomb, defying death and confirming the hope of salvation for all who would believe. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content. And be sure to check out the other videos popping up on your screen right now. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next one.